Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is always a pleasure to be here and diving into some pretty new and I think incredibly exciting explorations. I want to briefly invite you into some of my thought processes as we begin, where we already have in many ways, exploring our built environment and supply chains, large and small. I say this briefly in my interview with our guest today, who is Vince Beiser, who wrote The World in a Grain, which is a book about sand, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I've worked in supply chains for the last 15 years. It's just been in the food supply chain. And sometime last year, I became really interested in other supply chains and why food is the only supply chain that feels particularly visible to us as consumers. And I think that one of the reasons for this is that we feel that we have a sense of control over our food that we might not feel about other supply chains, like where our phones or our computers or our shoes or the paper for our books or all of these different things comes from. And yet, they are a huge part of our lives. And, as Vince reminds us in this, food is also a very intimate space. Our bodies are made out of food, but our bodies are increasingly also made out of the things that we put on them, whether that is the microplastics in our yoga pants, or it is the whatever we rub on our bodies that's been through an entire shipping process that came from somewhere. And I think that we are made out of place, and really increasingly we are made out of places. And this exploration was wanting to better understand both how resources are moved to us as humans and also the means by which they are moved to us as humans in terms of transport. And sand is really the beginning of that, because sand is the foundation of every house that we live in, of every building we step into. It is the thing that lets the light in the form of glass in our windows. And it is the way that we transmit information on silicon chips with glass screens on our phones and our computers. It is the basis for both our built and digital worlds, and certainly plays a rather large role in our natural world as well. And so exploring sand feels like something that is very important. And I think that this interview had a lot of really beautiful overlaps with my interview with Ben Goldfarb, where we explore roads and we explore infrastructure through the lens of beavers as well. I am going to continue this exploration of infrastructure, whether that's roads or buildings or dams or all of these different things, and of supply chains. I think that it is really fascinating. And there is something at the heart of this exploration for me that I don't know if I can yet fully describe. And so I will tell you that at the outset, that I feel incredibly compelled to explore supply chains, large and small, and especially those unseen. And I am telling a greater story, but I am still feeling around in the dark for the edges of exactly how that story is going to be made manifest. And so you are along for this journey with me as we explore some of these broader topics and ideas. I think I think you will be blown away by the world of sand. And as I read Vince's book, all of the sudden, new worlds were open to me. My eyes were open to how sand was all around me, not just in physical structures, but also in my language, right? We are building sand castles. This is how we measure time in an hourglass, but also an idea of transience and also an idea of something that endures. You'll find out about the average age of sand and be blown away that something that's 200,000 years old on average makes its way into all of these places that are both incredibly mundane and incredibly magical. When we work together to see the things that are unseen, to see the people that are unseen, to see the resources that are unseen within these supply chains, that something can begin to shift at a larger scale. I am not sure how. And I think that, unlike Vince, I am not sure that I would put, there's some discussion about like where does change happen. And one thing that I think is really complicated about this is that I believe that governments and corporations tend to be tied up in informing one another in a feedback loop that is incredibly hard to break. But I think that our awareness of some of these issues will begin to change that feedback loop. I just don't know how. And so I think in some of these explorations we might have to leave a little bit of room for, I don't know where we go from here. And I just know that I can't stop looking and peeling back the curtain on so many pieces of our world that touch us every day. And I'm so grateful that you are coming along for that ride and that you are here for this exploration with me. And I encourage you to stick around to the end of this interview, where I think we really bring it home, and I think we reintroduce some of the magic too. We start a little heavy and then we get a little bit more magical. I am incredibly grateful to Vince's work, and I hope that this interview, in its broad strokes, invites you to explore the book, which is actually, this is a little tongue in cheek, very granular in talking about sand and is incredibly rich in its detail about talking about all of these different spaces that sand touches. And so, without further ado, I would love to introduce my interview with Vince by. Oh, actually, wait. Hold on one second. We do have a little bit of housekeeping, which is, if you are as excited as I am about our exploration of supply chains and about resources that are unseen, and you want to make the unseen visible, the best thing that you can do to support this podcast is to leave a rating and review and hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you can catch the next episodes of Mind, Body, and Soil and find out about all the amazing materials that make our world work, and a lot of other personal explorations too, and to just go deep with me. So leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. That helps support the podcast, helps other earballs find the podcast, which supports it. It means that we can continue to get awesome guests, and you are supporting me, who produces every aspect of this podcast for you. It's just little old me here. So thank you so much for doing that. And now, without further ado, I have this week's episode with Vince Beiser, whose book, The World in a Grain, The Story of Sand and How It Transformed Civilization. really does tell you just that. Here's Vince. I always struggle to start a podcast because I think that you really want to start in a place that sort of introduces your work, but also introduces the concept. And the more, what we were talking about before I hit record is that your book, The World in a Grain, really started off a deep exploration of supply chains and infrastructure for me. And I was trying to consider what it was that I found so foundational, literally, about the book. And the more that I thought about it, the more I realized that sand is the foundation of three worlds that I think we as a society are trying to understand how they're intersecting. And so it's foundational to the natural world, to the built world and these civilizations that we have built. And it is also foundational to the digital or the virtual world, in that it's these silicon chips. And so I wondered what you thought of that, and if we could kind of start there.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I never thought about it quite like that. I mean, definitely the first two, right? I mean, so yeah, I mean, sand is, it's absolutely the foundation of modern civilization, in the literal sense, right? Because it's what our
Yes.
cities are built of, right? Sand, concrete, which is what most of our infrastructure, everything from apartment blocks and office towers to airport runways and dams, that's all built out of concrete, and concrete is just basically sand and gravel that's been glued together. um, Plus, all the roads that connect all those buildings, also made out of sand. All the windows, every single window in every one of those buildings, every piece of glass anywhere on Earth is also made out of sand. So even if you look at modern glass and steel buildings, well, the glass too is made out of sand. So sand is absolutely, you know the very literal foundation of modern civilization. And yeah, digital tech too, absolutely. It runs on silicon chips, and silicon chips are made from sand, ultimately from high purity silica sand. And yeah, in the natural world, I mean, sand obviously has a really important role to play. I never really quite thought about, like, what's how central is it to the natural world. I guess I would say, like, it seems to me, you probably know more about this than me, but it's obviously very important. But I think of soil as the real
Mm-hmm.
foundation of the natural world, right? Soil is
Mm-hmm.
is where life comes from, right? Soil nurtures life. Soil
Yeah,
is what everything grows out of. So I'd have to
I
give
agree.
sand, I think, 2 out of 3 central roles.
I agree that soil, I think there are a lot of soil and water, all these things play a really foundational role in the natural world. One of the things that I considered as I thought about this was sand feels like this manifestation of time itself. There's a passage in the book that sort of describes the geologic breakdown of rock over time, that a grain of sand is on average 200 million years old. And one of the things that I did consider is that as you have that mechanical breakdown over time, that is what frees up minerals within any given system to be taken back up by plant life as minerals, as nutrients, and sort of reincarnated into these soft tissues of plants and animals. And in that way, sand does have this kind of central role within the soil food web, as the one of the places where these minerals are coming from.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I never really thought about it that way. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I was just struck by how foundational this material is, both in terms of the buildings that you talked about, but also the things that facilitate more building, things like roads, which we explored quite a bit in an episode with Ben Goldfarb, who wrote an entire book about roads
Oh yeah.
and how much they have impacted our world. And in terms also of, I mean, even fracking and pulling up oil that allows so much of the world to sort of happen right now, as it were. And it is absolutely ubiquitous. It is everywhere, and it is also very unseen. And we are also running out of it, somewhat paradoxically.
Yeah.
And so that really struck me too, was its ubiquity, and we're running out.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think both of those things, that's kind of what got me, you know, one of the things that really got me interested in the first place too, is like, I had just never even thought about sand, right? Like who does, it's just like, it's everywhere and who needs it? Like, beyond like, having nice sand on the beach to go to, like, when do
Mm-hmm.
we ever even think about sand? Um, and then, you start looking into it and you come to realize, like, actually, it's, I call it the most important solid substance on Earth, which it kind of is. And it's crazy to think, it's this substance that's everywhere, right? And pretty much every country in the world you can find sand. It's the most abundant thing in the Earth's crust. And yet we're running out of it. And we're running out of it to such an extent that, we're causing massive environmental damage to get at the sand we need, tearing up riverbeds, stripping beaches bare. And in some places, there's even a black market that's developed around it. There's so much demand for it. And that's led to people being murdered over sand, which is that's how it came to my attention in the first place, is I read this story in an Indian newspaper about a farmer who'd been murdered over sand. And I just thought, what in the, like, who would kill somebody over sand, right? Like, who cares
Yeah.
about sand? But yeah, and it says so much about modern civilization, and sort of the condition that we find ourselves in, that like our consumption has reached such a level. We are consuming the planet's resources to such an extent that even something as ubiquitous and as abundant as sand, if we're starting to run out of the thing that we have more
Yeah.
of than anything else, that should really set your alarm bells ringing. It's not just all the stuff we hear about. It's not only fresh water, it's not only trees, it's not only fish in the ocean, but for God's sake, it's sand, right?
Yeah.
That to me is really alarming. It's both symbolic and a literal, sort of canary in the coal mine.
That struck me too. Is uh, the idea of it being a bellwether, that if we are running out of something that is this ubiquitous, that is this omnipresent in our life, what does it say about everything else? And I know that something that we've kind of been looking at, and this term came up on my episode with Ben Goldfarb, was this idea of this infrastructure tsunami, and there was a 2020, I know this was published after the book, there was a 2020 article in Nature that said that all of the infrastructure on the planet, that all of the human made materials, concrete, steel, asphalt, now outweighs all of the biomass on Earth. And that trajectory of that material use, there is an almost asymptotic, hockey stick like curve of growth to that. And this is something that you talk about time and time again in the book, that it is taking less and less time for us to use more and more materials in what William Lawrence termed an infrastructure tsunami. And
Yeah.
so much of that is sand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my favorite mind-blowing statistic is that China, all by itself, in about 3 years, just recently in the last decade, over the course of 3 years, they used more concrete, which meaning basically more sand, than the United States used in the entire 20th century. Right?
Yeah,
And you start
I
thinking
pulled
about that.
I pulled that quote because it was absolutely mind blowing. I
Yeah,
think it was
it's
between 2011 and
insane.
2013.
Just think about how many roads were built, how many, skyscrapers were built, how many dams, how many airports, how many sidewalks were laid in the United States between 1900 and 2000. And China used more concrete than that just in 3 years. And they haven't really stopped since. They're slowing down a little bit, but that's that incredible amount of consumption and building is still going on. And that's just China, right? I mean, China is the fastest growing economy in the world, or has been for the last several years for sure. But lots of other places are on the same trajectory, are going very quickly from, underdeveloped countries, what we used to call third world countries, to, doing their best to catch up to the level of development of industrialization that we've got here in the West. Indonesia, Nigeria, Vietnam, all over the world, these places are building like crazy. And it means, it's not just the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure itself consumes huge, huge, huge amounts of resources. And that's just literally paving the way for an economy that's going to consume ever more, ever huger quantities of energy, of cars, of food, of everything. And it's terrifying when you stop and think about it, because it's this crazy paradox, right? Like, of course, we can't, like, everybody in the world deserves to have a decent place to live and decent roads to travel on, and, all the other, the standard of living that we take for granted in the Western world. But there just isn't enough stuff. There aren't enough physical resources on the planet for everybody to live the way that we do. And that's, we're not just heading for a crisis. We're already in the crisis that we've got to, we've got to find a different way. We've got to change that trajectory somehow.
Yes. And I think that I'm actually curious if you think that there's there's a way to sort of right the ship, or how you sort of cope with the scale of it, because I think that as I've dug into this, and your book is great at sort of explaining the enormity of the sand that we're using. This, the term that we've come back to some on the podcast is a hyperobject. Are you familiar with Timothy Morton's work on hyperobjects? So just to give you a brief overview, a hyperobject, the idea is that it's something that is so big in comparison to our human scale that it is sort of impossible to fathom. And so this could be all the concrete in the world. It could be all the plastic ever created. It could be all the roads, right? There are 40 million miles of roads all across the globe. And so these are just almost numbers that are too big to hold. And I think that as I was reading The World in a Grain, so much of it is you're just dwarfed by the sheer enormity, the largesse of what we're using. And just like you said, all of this infrastructure moves more resources to us. It's and becomes not just about sand, but about the need to move more resources into cities and through more energy throughout the world. And, the big numbers, you talk about World uses enough concrete to build a wall 88 feet high and 88 feet wide right around the equator in a typical year. Yeah, and that makes it feel, I'm going to put this in really big quotes, tangible, right? Like, it's a really good way to kind of imagine that. And yet it is unfathomable, which makes it a hyperobject. And so how do we cope with this largesse?
Yeah, that's a big one. And I struggle with it all the time because, like, I use lots of numbers, and a lot of information about these kind of issues comes to us in numbers. And it's like billions of tons, megatons, gigatons, gigawatts. 17 billion tons of this stuff. And it's impossible to grasp, really. And we reach for these metaphors, like that's the equivalent of 18,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled with sand. But I can't really imagine what 18,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools is. It's really impossible to grasp. And I do feel like that's part of what makes it hard to take action, right? Because it's like
Mhm.
it's so huge for most people. It's just like it almost doesn't register when it's that big. It's just
Yeah.
like you're talking about something, that's so beyond your sort of like intuitive grasp that it makes it easy to just be like, wow, that's really big, but it doesn't sort of affect me viscerally because it's just so huge. I can't even fathom it. Um, yeah, I'm working on a new book, by the way, that we should probably talk about when it comes out.
I love that.
It's called Power Metal. And this one's about, it's going to be out this fall, and it's about a similar thing about all the metals that we need for the energy transition and for digital technology. So the idea there is, yeah,
Awesome.
like
I'm really excited about that.
good, great. But it's a similar kind of thing, right? Because we're shifting slowly, but we really are shifting from fossil fuels to renewables like wind and solar and electric cars and all the rest of it, which is great from a climate perspective. But again, we need huge amounts, really unfathomable amounts of resources to build all that stuff.
Lithium, cobalt, copper.
Exactly. Exactly. All that stuff. Rare.
And I'm sure all kinds of stuff that I'm missing in that
Yeah.
too.
Well, you hit the main ones. Yeah. And rare earths and it's the same story. Getting all that stuff from out of the ground causes huge environmental damage. There are people being murdered over this stuff.
Yes.
And yeah, it's just really hard. And the trap that we can fall into sometimes is to just sort of allow ourselves to be overwhelmed, to just feel like, oh my God, it's so huge. We're talking about, planetary scale processes and billions of tons of, oh my God, I can't, it's just too much. I can't even handle it. I'm going to go back to, I'm just going to reuse my soap container. And that's going to be my contribution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which fair enough.
I
right?
mean, I do think it causes us to cling to some of the small things that we feel like we can control. I didn't actually intend to take this here, but because we're here, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is consumers' attachment to the food supply chain in a way that they don't show the same interest in any other supply chain.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I've been reasoning is that the food supply chain feels like the last bastion of a supply chain that we can have some modicum of control over. Whereas the supply chains that belie, where my phone comes from, or where my car comes from, or where my shoes come from, or even where my soap container comes from, feel so far out of my control to the point that I can't even, too big, too large. And so I think we cling and carry those with us. And I actually think it's something that makes our interest in food interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it for sure. And it's also, I think it's the intimacy of food, right? I mean, you're literally putting food into your body every day.
Becomes you.
Right. And so people think about it a lot more. I mean, we're all, you're thinking about food, 3 times a day, if you're lucky, and more probably for a lot of us. Yeah, it's so, it's life, right? No food, no life. And it's, yeah, I mean, as a journalist, as a writer, I'm always trying to get people to think about other stuff in that same way, which is hard. But yeah, I mean, so one of like in this new book, I really harp on digital technology, our phones, our computers, because that too, I mean, these have become like, everybody's got a phone. Everybody's like, most of us, it's really a deep and intimate part of our every single day lives. So part of what I'm really trying to get across is like that thing that you hold in your hands, it's got a supply chain feeding it. All the pieces of it come from other places. And you really like, if you care about the planet, if you care about human rights, if you care about climate change, you really need to be thinking about how they built that phone in the same way that you worry about, like, oh, how did they, where did all the, how does my grocery store get these, strawberries in the middle of winter, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but yeah, it's tough though, because like you can't, if you'll drive yourself crazy if you try
Yeah.
to think about all of the things that we consume in our everyday life. You've got to, you know, you've got to sort of kind of choose your battles. I think like everybody's got to sort of choose where they're going to draw the line and where they're going to try to apply themselves to do some good, and that's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that exploration is worthwhile while holding the fact that we all use roads and many of us use phones and these are we build buildings and live in built buildings looking out glass windows. It's allowing me to see, and this is allowing me to transmit information. It's allowing for you and I to have this connection. And so I think for me it's also holding that paradox that these things are destructive, but they are also things that bring us a sense of connection or that bring us information or that house and keep us warm, keep us dry. And so it's kind of holding a lot of different disparate things all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I go around, whenever I give talks and stuff about sand, people are like, oh, how can we, this is terrible. Like all the problems that sand is causing, what's the solution? How can we stop using sand? Right.
Mhm,
And the answer, of course, is like, well, we can't, we really can't. And we shouldn't even
mhm,
want to. Like, sand is a great building material, concrete. There's a reason why people use concrete all over the world. It's a really good building material. And if you're trying to build, sturdy, safe, sanitary housing for millions and millions of people, to raise people up out of poverty and get them out of, dirt floor huts and into
yeah.
something safer, concrete is great for that.
Yeah, I was
And
struck just by a concrete floor how much you can decrease instances of diseases of sanitation problems, things like
exactly,
hookworms,
exactly.
right? I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. And, and a concrete road, man, that's way better than a dirt road. If you're trying to get kids to school or people to work or, have access to a hospital that's, 20 miles down the road, man, you want a paved concrete road. You don't want a dirt road. So it's a really good thing. But the key to it is, uh, is quantity, right? It's the dose makes the poison, right? So
Mm,
like, these things are, a material like concrete, is can be very good, but when you use too much of it, that's when it becomes a problem. And I really feel like that should be the guiding principle for so much of
mhm.
for how we're trying to organize life on this planet, right? Because by now we've got 8 billion people already on the planet. We're on our way to having 10 billion people. And you can't, there's just no way we can feed and clothe and house all those people without a lot of the processes and the materials that we're already using, right? Um, but we've got to find ways of just using less of them. The answer isn't like, okay, sand causes problems, therefore no sand. No, sand causes problems when we use too much of it and when we use it too irresponsibly. And we can solve a lot of those problems with all these things we're talking about, with sand, with food, with trees, whatever. A lot of those problems can be solved or at least really diminished, really ameliorated just by using less,
Mm,
by using them more intelligently, more efficiently, more effectively.
mm.
And that's really where we should be really focusing our efforts, is how can we, not how can we stop consuming this thing or that thing, but how can we
Yeah.
use less of it, so that we get to a place that's more sustainable, to use the buzzword.
Do you think that's driven at a consumer level, at a governmental level, at a corporation level? Some of this, I always think about the onus that we've put on consumers, that corporations have put on consumers, right? To kind of push the burden off. And I think that's how we get the idea that stop using plastic straws, and that's really going to
Right.
move the dial
That's going to save
in
the
that
world,
kind of way, right? Like that's going to change everything. It's recycling the can. And so I'm curious, when you talk about using less, do you envision that? Or when you think about it, what levels, I'm sure it's multiple, it doesn't have to be one, do you feel like that really begins to happen on?
Well, yeah, obviously, it's good to have action on all three of those fronts, and consumers, can definitely help drive it. I mean, they're the only things, like people, are ultimately the only things that are going to help drive it. But I think that the most, the most effective place that you're going to have an impact, it's got to be at the macro level, right? Like all this stuff that people get excited about doing at the micro individual level, right? Like not using plastic straws, and that's, it's nice, but really at the end of the day, it just doesn't make much difference at all, right? The main thing that it does is make you feel better about yourself, right? And I get a little frustrated with like people who are really super obsessed with, oh, I carry around a steel straw and I recycle, like I take my olive oil container back to the olive oil shop and I fill it up there. And that's, like I'm really saving the planet that way. Like you're just not, right? Mostly what you're doing is just making yourself feel better. Not that it's a bad thing.
Which has importance too,
Sure.
I think, at this point.
Sure. I mean, not to...
Again, it's that like bastion of control. And so we need to have that feeling that I'm affecting something.
Yeah. And not that it's a bad thing to reuse your olive oil bottle or your, soap container or whatever. I live in the kind of neighborhood, by the way, where there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. There's a shop down the road that does nothing but like fill bottles with soap, and people love it. People line up outside this store to get their things refilled with soap and stuff. And I'm like, that's great. It's definitely not hurting, but it really, again, it's really not making much of a difference in the big picture. It's really not making any difference in the big picture.
Yeah.
So what does make a difference in the big picture, is the most effective thing, I think, is government action, is policy level stuff, because it's got to happen. The problems are massive, right? They're really macro scale problems, and they need macro scale solutions. And, leaning on corporations, pressuring corporations to help out, that's great and that's good. And of course, they can do stuff. But again, a lot of what, and every, like all the big corporations know this now, like sustainability is such a big buzzword. You go to I've been going to a lot of mining industry conventions for this new book. That's one of the most
fascinating,
destructive industries there is.
Yeah.
And they know it, and they know they have a terrible public relations problem. And man, all the talk there is about sustainability and how greening our process. And they're putting a lot of effort and energy into talking about how concerned they are about the environment and about indigenous rights and about sustainability and da-da-da-da-da. And some of that is real, of course, but at the end of the day, they're corporations and their job is to make money. That's what they're built
they have
for.
Fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders.
So at the end of the day, you can't even get too angry at them for being profit driven. That's what they're built for. They're built to make money. So again, if you want to influence corporations, I think the best way to do it is not by, so much by boycotts and these kind of public pressure campaigns. Those are good. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for them. But you have a much bigger effect. Like what will impact them much more is if the government, state governments, national governments, force them to do stuff that's in the public interest, right? Or provide them really big incentives. So, it's great to say oh, you should be getting much more of your energy from renewable sources. Yeah, they should. And if they keep hearing that from, activists and public pressure campaigns, they will definitely start talking more about it. And they'll probably start doing a bit more of it. But if the federal government steps in and says, you know what, we're actually going to raise the taxes on fossil fuel energy. We're going to make it more expensive. And we're going to put on a little subsidy for every whatever megawatt of solar or wind energy that you use, you'll get a little tax break. Man, that will shift their behavior in a big fat hurry. So I really feel that, that's all these things. Like, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you're already pretty involved in this stuff. And I'm not trying to denigrate any citizen-led campaigns or corporate shaming campaigns or anything like that. It all helps. But really what helps, what really drives things is government action, when the government steps in and, uses their power to do, to force things to happen that we know need to happen.
Yeah. No, thank you for exploring that line of inquiry, just because I think that is, especially with sand and with looking at metals too. I mean, it's such a, how does this change becomes part of the question. And so I'm appreciative of you kind of exploring that with me. I want to rewind a little bit, and I actually want to talk a little bit about that urban rural. I was really interested that part of this infrastructure tsunami, that part of this need for so much more, and to go back to the idea of less, you talk about the move to cities driving some of the use of sand in particular. And I always think that anytime we're having a big move from rural to urban, we're having a big shift. I mean, when you talk about the emptying of the commons, that is because of the Industrial Revolution. And so, to go back to Britain at sort of the turn of the last century, and so I thought that this was really interesting, that move and that divide, that more than half of the population right now lives in cities.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really amazing. I mean, I hadn't fully appreciated just how much urbanization has changed everything. And just recently, I mean, just really in the last 150 years or so. But yeah, I mean, most people now on Earth live in cities, and that's a trend that's is clearly just going to continue. Basically, what's happening worldwide is the same thing that happened, in the United States and Canada, where I live, about 100 years ago. That people are moving from rural, from rural areas into cities because that's where the money is. It's harder and harder to make a living farming. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that.
Average margin for farmers across the United States is 2.4%. And so I will tell you that means that most farmers are actually operating in the red.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and most farming it doesn't really take, the bulk of our farming is done by machines now, right? It just doesn't take nearly as much human labor or human involvement as it used to.
No.
So where's the opportunity? The opportunity is in cities. So, and that same process, so that really kicked in, with the Industrial Revolution in the US, and especially, around the 1910s, 1920s, farming got mechanized. Cities were growing because of industrialization, and people just moved en masse out of the countryside and into the cities. So, but that process in the United States happened, it involved, many millions of people moving from the countryside into cities over the course of a couple, 3 decades, right? Yeah. So that was major. But now what's happening now worldwide is you have hundreds of millions of people moving into cities over the course of just a few years. So the same process, but on a much bigger scale and in a much shorter time frame. I mean, if you look at a place like China, they had hundreds of millions of people pouring out of the countryside and into cities in the course of just a few years, single digit numbers of years. And that is colossal. And again, that's happening, you pick a country, same thing is happening, everywhere from, from Southern Europe to Central Africa, to Thailand, anywhere. Urbanization, the world is becoming much, much, much more urbanized. And of course, brings us back to sand, right? What are cities made of? Cities are made out of sand. And that's really that's probably the major thing that's driving this incredible consumption of sand and all the things we use sand for is cities, because cities are literally built out of sand, and we're building cities on a scale and at a pace that has never even remotely happened in human history.
Yeah, you cover some of those numbers. Again, you do such a beautiful job of really covering those numbers in a way that feels at least maybe a little bit more tangible inside of the book, but just how staggering it is and just how much it has changed over the century. Again, this sort of asymptotic curve of growth that is driving people to the cities. Cities are driving the use of sand. Going to the cities, one of the things, it wasn't about this, but you had this quote in there. It was about the move to Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale. But at the end, you said sand abetting sand abetting sand. And I think one of the things that is really fascinating about this is there does seem to be an almost positive feedback loop that's building on itself, where the digital world, which is built on, and we should talk about this a little bit, on silicon chips that are made out of sand, is driving a lot of the money in cities. That is increasingly where money is being made, is in the digital world, not as much in the physical realm of farming that I occupy, right? Which drives the move to cities, which drives the use of sand to build cities and roads that lead into the cities that are, again, made out of sand. And so there's this sand abetting sand that is happening. And so it sort of begets itself.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it's, that's sort of that's the model of development, right? In the world run on capitalism, right? The more development is basically synonymous with more consumption, right? So you use sand to build up your infrastructure, to build up your cities. More people move into your cities. They get richer. They consume more. They buy more clothes. They eat more meat. They drive more cars. They get bigger TVs. And that in turn makes other people richer. And so that, the idea is it's the rising tide that raises all boats. But again, that only works up to a certain point, right? So the problem we have now is, like, everybody all over the world looks at this lifestyle that we kind of invented in the United States and in the Western world, where, like, everybody's got, not everybody, but the model, the ideal that probably most people in the US have is, like, everybody's got their own place to live, ideally their own detached house with a garage. Everybody's got their own car. Everybody drives on, great big freeways to an office where they work. Everybody drives to a shopping mall where there's, like, everything you can imagine is on sale. And that's the good life. And then on the weekends, you take your snowmobile out, or you take your boat to the lake, or you get on a plane and you fly somewhere nice for a vacation. It's a nice life, but there's just no way that 10 billion people can live that way. And but that's what everybody wants, of course. And that's where we're headed, and that we're, like, trying to get everybody there. And that's part of what drives climate change. That's part of what drives all these crises that we're getting. And and it all sort of builds on itself. The more the more infrastructure that you build, the more you raise people's expectations, and the more that you raise their ability to access all that stuff, which creates more demand, which creates more of a strain on supply. And at a certain point, it starts to break down, and that's kind of the point that we're in right now.
Yeah. You actually introduced me to the idea of the sort of consuming class, which is something that you come back to in the book, is just how many people are reaching a sort of global middle class where you're able to have enough disposable income to access sort of luxury items to sort of build in excess. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and just trying to couch how all of this plays out.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm, we always, we usually talk about, the Western world as driving like all these problems. Oh, we in the West, we consume so much. It's kind of all our fault, which is true to a point, but that model isn't really, it's kind of outdated. Like definitely like we in the West, like we're, Western Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, we're still on balance and per capita, we're definitely the richest part of the world, and we consume more than anybody else. But what's really changed in the last 20, 30 years is there are lots and lots of people in the developing world who basically live the same as we do, who are that middle, that consuming class, like hundreds of millions of, like there's as many middle class people in China as there are Americans. There's something on the order of 300 million people in China.
Well, yeah,
who basically live like we
330
do.
million people in the U.S.
Yeah, who basically live like we do in the U.S. And there's many, many, many millions more in India. Like I don't need to list all the countries again, but all these big developing countries that a lot of us still think of as like, oh, those are poor countries. And they are on a per capita basis, but there are tons of people in them who basically live like we do in the West, and those people are just as implicated in all of the crisis of overconsumption as the rest of us are. And that's, I mean, I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah. No. I think that's great. And I think let's take a minute, and I want to go back because I don't want to miss the idea of the digital world. And I do want to make sure that people understand, right? We've kind of talked about the way that infrastructure utilizes sand, at least at a broad stroke. And one thing that I really want to encourage people to do is the book is so rich with detail in how concrete and how glass and how all of these different things are sort of created and mined and utilized. And so I really want to encourage people to dive into the fascinating processes that you get into and that you really show. But I also want to touch on how sand is foundational to the digital world, because I think this is actually a piece that, well, what we've been talking about is not very obvious and is unseen. I think the idea that silicon is glass and that this is what is carrying so much of our information in the digital age is perhaps even more unseen than some of the sand that goes into infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. Yeah. So like sand, who would think that like there's like the most, the rawest of raw materials is literally it's the brains of all of our digital devices, right? Silicon chips, which are literally the brains of computers, of cell phones, of everything else, the microprocessors that everything runs on. So when we talk about sand, first of all, I should just back up and explain a little bit. So the word sand, it can mean little, it just means little hard bits of anything, right? So sand can be any kind of rock, granite or feldspar or whatever, that's of a certain size, the size of a grain of sand. It can also be crushed up shells. That's why, like, if you go around the world, you see beaches of different colors. You got black sand beaches in Hawaii, or green sand beaches. You got pink sand beaches in the Caribbean. That's because the sand is made of different stuff. Those grains are like, in black sand beaches, it's volcanic rock that's been crushed up. In pink sand beaches, it's usually shells that have been crushed down by waves and everything else. But most of the sand in the world is quartz. It's quartz sand that's the most abundant on the planet, and it's quartz sand that we're really talking about when we talk about sand. It's quartz sand that we make, that makes concrete, and makes glass and makes silicon chips. Quartz is a form of silica. So the silicon, as in Silicon Valley, is basically an ultra purified sand. It's when you take high purity silica sand and run it through a absolutely mind-boggling gamut of industrial processes, chemical processes. You got to melt it down. You got to treat it with all kinds of different chemicals, run it through all these different processes to purify it into, 99 point. It's 11 nines.
I think it's 11 nines. Yeah.
I'm not even making that up. That's a actual literal measurement. That's how pure the silicon has to be to manufacture silicon chips. But it starts out as just basically quartz sand. So sand is literally the brains of our computers. And then of course, your phone, that screen, the glass screen, also made out of sand. Glass too is made from silica sand, and it also has to be run through a whole bunch of processes. It has to be melted down. It has to be purified, all of which uses a lot of energy. Sometimes it uses a lot of chemical processes. There's a real there's an environmental cost to manufacturing all of that, the glass that we need, and then all of the silica. And then there's a weird little side note that I go into in the book as well. So, excuse me.
No, you're fine.
To manufacture silicon, so you get to a certain point where you've melted down and you've purified your silicon, and you have to melt it down again, but you have to melt it. The vessel that holds that silica as you're melting it also has to be ultra pure. It has to be made out of something that is not going to allow even a molecule of itself into that silicon, right? Because you've got to maintain that ultra high purity. Well, it turns out the best thing, the vessel, the crucible that to melt that silicon down in, the best thing to make that crucible out of is quartz, right? Again, a super high version of silicon. And the quartz, it has to be super high purity quartz to build those crucibles. Turns out there's really only one place in the world where you can find quartz sand pure enough to make those crucibles, and that is in an area of North Carolina. It's up in the hills of North Carolina, an area called Spruce Pine. So almost all of the quartz sand to make the crucibles that our silicon comes from this one little area in North Carolina. It's absolutely crazy to think about.
You might have touched on this in the book. Are those crucibles used for a long period of time, or do they have a relatively short lifespan?
That's a really good question that I should have the answer to, and I have to admit, I don't know.
That's perfectly all right. I think one of the things that I thought some of in this book was about, especially when it comes to tech, is about planned obsolescence and the way that a lot of tech manufacturers create ways in which our technology becomes obsolete and we have to purchase it yet again,
Mm.
and sort of what the ramifications are for that on a scale of all of these different things. And I mean, I think it's worth noting here too, and really important to note, that infrastructure also breaks down, but we are much more incentivized to make infrastructure that lasts for as long as possible, in a way that we are not incentivized to make a computer or a cell phone that lasts as long as possible.
Yeah, for sure. Um, what can I say about that? I mean, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and you don't have to say anything. I just, in terms of that crucible, I mean, if it's just coming from one place, I think, again, anytime that we have a really heavy reliance on one place for a single thing, that creates a very brittle supply chain,
Yeah,
as it
it's a
were.
big problem for sure. But I'll say this too about infrastructure. One of the things that we often forget, and one of the this is a big issue in terms of sand, is our infrastructure is not going to last like we want it to last. But concrete, which is what most of it's made out of, it does not last forever. We've only been using concrete on a mass scale since about like the early 1900s. And a lot of that concrete that we've put in place, all those roads and dams and bridges and all the rest of it, it's going to break down. All of it is going to break down sooner or later. And that is going to be a really big problem going forward. Because basically everything that we've built, we're going to have to replace within the coming decades. So all of those billions and billions of tons of sand that we've already like dug up and turned into concrete and placed, we're going to have to do all of that again. We're going to
Yes.
have to continue doing that in the decades ahead, as all of that, all those bridges and highways and everything else, it's going to crack, it's going to fail, it's going to need to be replaced. So that's going to be a huge problem. It means, enormous amounts of sand and concrete and energy and money are going to be required
Yes.
to keep, not just to build new infrastructure, but just to replace existing infrastructure as it ages out.
Mm. And I assume that we will see quite a bit of that happen in our lifetime, especially since you had this infrastructure boom within the United States. What the 1950s were really some of that really big infrastructure boom, when some of those dams and bridges that are going to be in desperate need of repair here soon. And you illuminated a little bit about, because they take cores, like there's a whole industry of people that test this and that look at the health of concrete to see where it is in terms of needing repair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's not. I mean, every couple of years, the I think it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers comes out with what they call a report card on our infrastructure, like how's it doing, and it's always bad.
Bad. Yeah, it is not good.
Yeah, things like bridges and dams, especially, they just they don't get inspected nearly enough, and lots of them, like there's thousands and thousands of them that are at risk of failure, which can mean anything from just like breaking down, cracking to the point where they're hard to drive over, to completely collapsing.
Yeah. And this is mainly due to, I'm interested too to kind of bring water into the conversation in a couple of different ways. This is going to be a weird way to enter it, but a lot of concrete breaking down has to do that when it cracks, water gets in there, and it actually has more to do with the steel rebar that's inside of it than it does the concrete itself. Is that right? That it begins to break down the steel.
Yeah, bravo. Wow, you are a very attentive reader. You're a writer's dream, man.
Yeah, yeah. I really like to read, and I usually read things. I usually listen to them once and read them once before podcasts, which
Wow.
comes cemented as long as I like the narration. Which Will Damron narrates your book, and he does a beautiful job. He also narrated Ben Goldfarb's Eager,
Oh yeah.
which is about beavers, which have a lot more in common with sand than I think one might think. And in terms of sort of building infrastructure and the way that they would have created catchments of sand throughout time too, because that's really what a dam does, is catch a certain size particulate matter, and sort of create, was a big engineer of ecosystems, especially here within the United States. And the United States looks vastly different without beavers, but this is sort of a side note. But water is a big part of what is going to break down that internal infrastructure. But also, and you posit this in the book, and I think it's really interesting, there's an idea around some self-healing concrete and bacteria, which is so neat, that might actually be part of at least maybe creating more longevity within our concrete.
Yeah, yeah. There's some really cool stuff out there, some really cool research, and I think some products that are already starting to hit the market. Yeah, they call it self-healing concrete because I mean the reality is all concrete is going to crack sooner or later, no matter what. Some sooner and some later. There's higher quality and lower quality, and there's lots of corners you can cut. But at the end of the day, it's all going to crack sooner or later. And water is going to get in those cracks, and it's going to freeze and thaw. And it's going to make those cracks bigger, and it's going to wreck the concrete, and it's going to get to the steel rebar and rust the steel rebar, and that's how you get bridges collapsing and dams collapsing and all the rest of it. So if you can stop that, if you can like seal those cracks early on, obviously that's way better than waiting until your dam collapses. So yeah, there's a few different ways that that people are looking into making that happen. Yeah, and one of them is there's these bacteria that you can put into the concrete that, if I'm remembering this right, they just lie there dormant, doing nothing until they get hit with water. Like, so eventually the concrete cracks, a little water gets in there, hits the bacteria, and the bacteria wake up like, oh, what's going on? Oh, there's water hitting me. And these bacteria excrete, don't ask me to explain how, but somehow this bacteria excretes a calcium, some form of calcium. Like, they just wake up and they get activated. And what they do when they're activated is they just spew out this stone, basically, right into the crack. So it's sealed. So the crack gets sealed right up, so the bacteria can then go back to sleep. So, ideally, like, it just happens automatically. Nobody has to do anything. It's just literally fixes itself. And there's another, I'm not remembering the details right off, but there's basically the same idea, but using a kind of gel. There's some kind of chemical you can put into the concrete that is activated if water gets in there, and the chemical then spews out some kind of a gel that fills in the concrete. It's a super cool idea, right?
It is
a rock that knows how to fix itself.
Yeah, and I think that there's some beautiful almost reciprocity within it, in that we could not have seen that bacteria without the use of glass, without microscopes, von Leeuwenhoek, and the creation of something that allows us to see the incredibly small. That sand is the vehicle for that, as well as seeing the incredibly big in space, and getting to better understand our place in the universe. And I do want to put that in here because I think that this topic feels heavy in some literal and metaphorical ways, and that does have some sort of reciprocal nature, that we can see this tiny bacteria and understand the calcium, whatever it is that it's excreting when it's exposed to water because of sand, and here it could help improve the longevity of some of our infrastructure.
Yeah, what a great segue.
Yeah.
It's amazing how you brought that around.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
really glad you brought that up. That was something that I had never at all thought about, that absolutely blew my mind when I was researching the book, is the idea of lenses. What you just said,
Mhm.
that the science, the scientific revolution, and still science today, it depends so much on lenses, right? On microscopes and on telescopes, these little bits of glass that make so much more visible to us than was ever possible before, right? With microscopes, we can see those little bitty bacteria. With telescopes, we can see the cosmos and understand so much more about our place in the world. And all of that is because of lenses, which are just little pieces of glass, which are only made possible because of sand. They're just made out of sand. And when you trying to trace some of that back was so interesting to me, because a lot of the earliest modern scientists, they were lens makers, like Anton van Leeuwenhoek, one of the
Mhm.
scientists who really who kind of discovered cells, right? Like the way that
Mhm.
all of matter is made up of, or organic matter is made up of these little cells. Those guys had to be lens makers because there was no other way to you know to get the kind of specialized lenses they need to build their microscopes so they could look at this stuff. And to be a lens maker, you also had to know about sand, right?
Mhm.
Like, you had to go to the glass makers who had the line on the really, really pure sand. You had to get their glass. You had to know that they got their sand to make their glass from this really pure place, so that their glass would be pure enough that you could grind it down fine enough and it would work to make your lens. But it was so interesting to me. Like, I just never thought about how that one invention that seems kind of simple, the lens, how that just changed the course of history. Absolutely.
Vastly. I think it's worth mentioning too that there's some ideas. I mean, the age of information was made possible maybe by the printing press, yes, but it was also the lenses that we were using for our myopia that allowed us to read at a
Yeah.
bigger scale.
Yeah. Glasses. Where would we be without glasses?
Glasses.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
was some study, I think I mentioned it in the book, that talked about how they sort of tried to quantify how much more sort of knowledge was able to be generated just because these early scientists had glasses, right? Because if you think about it, like,
Mhm.
everybody's vision starts to fail at a certain point. And before there were glasses, it meant that your career was kind of over, like in your 40s, because you just
Yeah.
couldn't read anymore.
Can't read, you can't do any fine work. I mean, even lens making itself, I imagine, has some fine work involved that perhaps could not be done because of myopia. So, and any sewing, any stitches, anything that's happening in that up close field of view,
Yeah.
it was done.
So imagine that, like, there you hit like whatever, 45, and you've mastered your craft and you've learned all this stuff and you've got all this knowledge in your head. But then you just, like, you can't take it any further, right? Because you just can't see what you're doing anymore. But now we have glasses, and now everybody can stay productive. You can at least keep reading for decades and decades. And
Yeah.
I always
Sand.
found it super interesting that, you know, there's speculation that it was this, like, the Western Europeans' invention of the lens basically was one of the things that let Western Europe just leapfrog ahead of
Mhm.
China, because China had been, much more scientifically advanced than Europe for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, and then at a certain point, they lost that edge, right? And Western world just went zooming past everybody else. And there's this notion that, it was the lens that was one of the key things that helped them do that, because Chinese knew about glass. They knew how to make glass, but they just never, for whatever reason, they just never really took much of an interest in it. They never really
Mm.
developed it much. It was sort of a curiosity, like, it was pretty, but they just never sort of figured out or took an interest in developing it into lenses. And Western Europeans did in the whatever 1300s, 1400s, which is just around right exactly at the time where we really start to zoom ahead of older civilizations like China. And that was, it makes a lot of sense that was one of the sort of key reasons for that, is we just kind of glommed on to this one particular invention that turned out to be the key to unlocking so much else.
I feel like throughout time, sand becomes that key, whether it's concrete in the Roman Empire. I know that the Mayans also had used some cruder concrete that was then lost after the Romans for a while. But you have these shifts in world building, right? So you have concrete, and then you have concrete again in multiple places. You have the lens, then you have the silicone chip. You have these things that radically shift the trajectory of our world, the basis of which oftentimes is sand.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really true. It's just amazing all through history what an absolutely, fundamental role these little grains have had, Ancient
Yeah.
Egyptians used sand. I mean, so many civilizations have used sand um, as a building material, as for all these different purposes. It's crazy.
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't touch on this. One of the things we've talked a lot about, just because I have a background in agriculture on the podcast, is topsoil erosion. And one thing that you say in the book felt really profound to me, and I wanted to read it. You say, without plant roots to anchor it and moisture to weight it, topsoil blows away, leaving behind only pebbles and sand, which means that at the same time that we're running out of the sand we need, we're generating more of the kind we don't.
Yeah.
And I did want to touch on this because I think the process of desertification and the way that we use water, and I think that your chapter on Dubai has got to be one of the most fascinating, horrifying, just mind-boggling chapters of how we are quite literally building worlds out of sand. But that water and topsoil erosion and desertification are also very much a part of this conversation. And that, on the podcast we've talked about, we lose 20 to 40 billion tons of topsoil, per year. We've lost over half of our topsoil endowment in the last 200 years of farming here in the United States. And so that is this generation of sand that we can't use while we backfill it, in various ways, while we build worlds with sand that we're quickly running out of. And so I did want to touch on that.
Yeah. It's sort of that chapter on desertification. It's sort of the outlier. Like most of the book is about sand as our friend, like how we've used sand as our ally to help us build and help us do all this stuff. But yeah, there's also this front where sand is our enemy, where sand takes over, where land gets turned into desert. And yeah, it's a super complicated issue. I'm sure you probably know a lot more about it than I do. But yeah, I mean, I talked about it in China, where it's a really big problem, and they're spending billions of dollars and trying to beat back the desert, basically, because they're
the green wall.
Yeah, the Great Green Wall, where they're trying to plant
Great Green Wall.
billions and billions of trees to basically stop the desert from advancing, to prevent desert from taking over any more land. And all there's lots of issues with that. It's creating a lot of its own problems, but it's a problem worldwide, right? Like, it's in Africa, in many parts of the world, and it all comes back to the same thing, right? We're just using too much. We're using too much water. We're sucking too much water out of the soil, whether it's for industrial agriculture or whether it's for industrial purposes, or whether it's to feed cities, just for drinking water and whatever else in cities. and that dries out the land. And when the land gets dry, often, the desert takes over. And that's a really hard process to reverse once it's happened.
It is. I mean, we've talked some about building topsoil here on this podcast, but it is a very hard problem to reverse. And I think we've seen the Dust Bowl in the 30s. One of the books I told you I'm reading J. Owen's Dust right now, and something else that I picked up to kind of supplement everything was Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time, where he talks about the Dust Bowl, because that is very much, a cautionary tale of what happens specifically when you have agriculture that's extractive of water. And the New York Times last fall did a beautiful piece on groundwater use here in the United States and that process of desertification. And so I thought that this was a really interesting sort of double-edged sword with sand, or this paradoxical quality where we're making more sand that we can't use while we're running out of the sand that we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that Times, there was a big thing about groundwater. And
Mm-hmm.
what I'm guessing the bottom line is we're using up all our groundwater, and it's
Yes.
a big problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I figured.
Yeah, I mean that really is the short of it. And just talking about water intensive agricultural practices, but also drilling practices, right? And then you talk about the need for sand in fracking. I mean, water is used. I mean, the water is used in also the creation of concrete. That requires
Mhm.
a massive amount of water as well. I mean, water is used in sort of every piece of our lives, and it is a resource that we are quickly depleting, and it has this relationship with sand that I think is really important. And I think that in some ways the chapter on Dubai, which again I just can't say enough good things about, really highlighted that, as you've built this city in the middle of the desert, where you have the highest water use per capita at 145 gallons per person per day, which is just so unfathomable.
Yeah, I mean, Dubai to me is just like, that is the ultimate example of, this sort of Western invented idea of modernity,
Mhm.
taken to its craziest
Excess.
extreme.
Yes.
It's this ultra modern city, um, with all the conveniences and luxuries that we've all come to expect, in the middle of the desert, in a place that makes absolutely no sense for there to be a city of 2 million people consuming that much water and energy and concrete and everything else. But that's, it's just kind of the ultimate expression of what we've been doing for the last 100 years, is just like nature schmature. We know how to handle nature. We're just going to build our city wherever we feel like it. We're going to build Phoenix in the middle of the desert. We're going to build Los Angeles in a place where there's no, where there's barely any water. We're going to build Houston and just let Houston get as big as it wants. Who cares? We can, because we've got the power to do it. And Dubai is
Yeah,
yeah, really sort of the highest
it
expression of that
is.
so far.
That's a good way of putting it, that it is the sort of peak of our excess in that particular regard. Um, I know we're close on time, and one of the ways that I was going to wrap up was asking you how you grapple with the largesse, but we kind of covered that in the earlier bit of the podcast, which in many ways I love, because I think that it gives people a little bit of an anchor through the podcast of how we might grapple with just the largesse of the problems that we face. And I think that one thing that really, I mean, sand struck me in every way, right? It really boggled my mind that there it was at the biggest turns of civilization, which we talked about, and just what an important role it plays in natural world and built world and in digital world. And it also struck me that sand is in many ways a sort of manifestation of time, that, and in our language too, in the way that we talk about the sands of time, or the way that we put sand in an hourglass. And so it just feels so foundational, and that it's everywhere. And I just can't tell you that this book, I mean, I'm looking out a window right now and getting natural light, all thanks to sand, and that I can't stop seeing it everywhere. And again, I think while that can be a little bit exhausting and maybe we have to take a step back, it is mind-boggling that it is so omnipresent and yet so unseen. And I'm grateful to you for seeing it and showing, opening this door for all of us to see it in such rich detail.
Well, geez, what can I say to that? I'm blushing.
Well, it's true. It's true. And it really did. It sort of set me off on a different trajectory of wanting to explore our world in a different way.
Well,
So I'm thank you for writing it.
well, thanks. I mean, really, what can I say? I really appreciate hearing that. You are totally making my day.
Great.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's super flattering to talk to a reader who's paid that much attention to it. I'm really glad to hear it. And I'm also really glad that that you're getting the word out about, not just my book and not just about sand, but how it's really, like, what I always say is it's not just sand. Sand is just a symptom of the bigger problem, which is that we're just consuming too much of everything. And
Yes.
that's, like, the takeaway I really hope that the takeaway of folks listening is not like, oh my God, how can we use less sand? But like, oh my God, sand too? Wow, how can we use less of everything? How can we live our lives and build our cities in ways that just consume less?
Yes. Yes. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is what it's meant as a people that started by moving to resources, right? When we talk about a more hunter-gatherer oriented society, we move our bodies where the resources that we need are, whether that's, there's some theories that timber and kindling actually moved us before food, that it was the need for that we were collecting all the timber and kindling in an area,
Hmm,
and so fuel moved us forward.
interesting.
But now we move everything to us,
Hmm,
and I think that transition marks, I mean, it marks what I think we call the agricultural revolution in many ways,
hmm,
and that marks this very big change. But I think that one of the questions that I deeply want to explore that this opened up is just how we move those resources to us. I mean, even you talk about, we don't want sand pits in our backyards and how much it takes to truck sand or to ship sand. And then that asks some questions about roads and trucking and also shipping. Rose George has a beautiful book called 90% of Everything that
hmm.
explores shipping. And so it it does. I mean, that curiosity, and I think the ubiquity of sand does ask us, okay, well, what about everything else? And then there are all these doors to go through.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked about you brought up transportation, because what the one
Yeah.
last thing that I'll say is, if you want to make a difference, like as an individual, as overwhelming as all of it is, probably the biggest single thing that individuals can do is cars. Do whatever you can to not own a car, right? So whether
Mm.
that's like replacing it in your life, or advocating at your local level, at your state level, at the
Hmm.
national level, to promote bicycling, walkability, public
Mhm.
transport, whatever you can do. Again, it's not that cars are evil, right? I have a car. I bet you have a car, right? We need
Yeah, I mean, I live in the middle of nowhere.
exactly. So,
Kind
like,
of, yeah.
lots of us need cars, and cars are super useful. But the problem is, there's way too many cars. Um, Using too much energy, taking up too much space, and they have a huge impact on sand too. Because if you think about it,
Mhm.
right, so much of our built environment, so much of the concrete we pour is for the benefit not of us, but of cars, right? We build
Roads.
garages for cars, we build parking lots for cars, we build parking spaces,
Oh shit.
right?
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
we could just reduce, I'm not saying get rid of your car. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you have a car, but I am saying
Yeah.
if we can work towards a world that just has 20%
Hmm.
fewer cars than we have right now, right?
Mhm.
if the average American family has one car instead of two cars, then we can build 20% fewer garages. We can make all of those huge parking lots 20% smaller.
Mm-hmm.
We will save
Wow.
millions and millions of tons of sand by cutting down on car use, right? On top of course, all the climate change benefits and all the, everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But I really, like I say, and this is even more the case with the metals that I'm talking about in the book I'm working on now.
I wanted to touch base on that.
Right? Yes, we have to move to electric cars. Yes, but we will be doing much better if we move to electric cars and fewer cars. That'll do so much to save on resources, energy use, all these problems we've been talking about. Cars are a huge part of it.
I love that. I do drive a car. I drive a 97 4Runner, so I haven't gotten a new car, but wow. I love that. And I do want to, before we get off, I want to tell it, there will be links in the show notes to World in a Grain, but I also want to touch on power metals and to just give everyone the heads up that that's coming. And maybe you will join me again when that comes out for a chat, because that is right up my alley. Okay. Well, Vince, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm so excited for everyone to hear this. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.